Let's take a look at the Serv-U management console. Administration of Serv-U is organized hierarchically. There's a global level to define limits and settings and directories, users, and groups for the server as a whole. But you have to create a domain. A Serv-U domain is really just a bundle of listeners for specific file transfer protocols that you've enabled. Now, the domain will inherit from the global level, but also afford you opportunities to override any settings. Serv-U supports multiple domains. When you log into the management console, you can do so through a browser connection from the local server or remotely if you've enabled remote access. You'll land on the global dashboard, which provides session statistics and a server log, just as a high-level overview of what's taking place on the server. The Server Activity tab will show the same statistics and log, but also provide you with user and group statistics, which you can access for specific users or groups or collections of. And then you can look at the currently active sessions, disconnect sessions, abort transfers, spy and chat on sessions, or broadcast a message to FTP clients. The Server Details tab displays information pertaining to the entire file server itself. IP access allows you to establish access control lists, either explicitly allowing or explicitly denying access to the file server from certain CIDR blocks. The Serv-U Gateway tab is where you would configure a Serv-U gateway connection to one or more Serv-U gateways. Database allows you to use an ODBC driver to connect to a remote database for user and groups. It's probably required if you're deploying Serv-U MFT in certain high availability configurations. Events allow you to automatically run programs or send an email when certain events are triggered. Common events showing a balloon tip on the Serv-U server itself within the task tray if it's running on Windows or Linux, or writing to a Windows event log, or maybe you want to write to a message queue. The license information tab shows you at what tier your file transfer server is licensed at, either FTP or MFT, and how many Serv-U gateway licenses you have as well. The Users tab is where you configure users globally for the server. You can also configure your database users as well if you have the ODBC data source configured in the Server Details tab. Groups allow you to logically group users together, assigning certain account settings to each user account that's in that group. Um, Accounts can be members of multiple groups even. You can also define those groups within the database, which is required if you are deploying in a high availability mode. Directories configure a directory structure that's available to all users on the server. You can also configure virtual paths, which are similar to symlinks. They place a directory in the user's home directory, allowing users to access some shared resources. Limits and settings at the global level applies to the entire server. There are different types of limits and settings that you can establish, either for connections themselves, password policies, directory listings, data transfer, settings specific to HTTP, email settings, file sharing settings, as well as advanced settings. These settings are highlighted blue if they're the default settings. And they're highlighted in white if there's some type of override. Now you can configure multiple settings and they would apply at different times of day or different days of the week. So there's a lot of flexibility in the configuration here. The Settings tab provides connection settings. If you want to block users who try to connect more than a certain number of times within a certain time period, this would allow you to stop bad actors that are trying to brute force passwords. You can hide server information from the SSH identity, and you can set the default web client for users when they connect, whether it's the file sharing functionality or the web client or the new web client. You can also customize the look and feel of Serv-U when people access the login page. Your password recovery message can be configured here, as well as any network-specific settings like auto-configuring through UPnP or requiring matching peer IP addresses for control and data connections. FTP settings are listed here, where you can customize the command processor. It's very flexible in Serv-U. You can edit these properties. The encryption settings allow you to define your SSL certificates and your SSH private key for SFTP connections. You can also customize your use of SSH ciphers, MACs, and key exchange algorithms as well. The custom HTML allows you to specify your custom HTML container directory, your cascading style sheet, your header file, your footer file. When you enable custom HTML, this customizes the look and feel of Serv-U login page. File sharing can either be enabled or disabled entirely, or you can use the limits and settings for particular users and groups who gets to access the file sharing functionality to share with guest users. You can define an invitation email template using macros. The macros will be expanded when the email is sent, replacing the macro name with the value it represents. All right, finally, let's cover the Serv-U domain. Now, when you install Serv-U, it will guide you through the installation wizard to create a domain. This is not the same as an internet domain or an Active Directory domain, although it's kind of similar because an internet domain could correspond with a Serv-U domain as well as an Active Directory domain, but really this is just a bundle of configuration through which you would configure file sharing or different protocols. So you give your domain a name. I'm going to go with an example name here. And then you choose the type that this domain is going to be. Either it's for file transfer only, at which point you'd disable file sharing, or it's just for file sharing, or it's for both. Notice the change in selection here is going to change the steps in creating the domain. I'm going to show you what it looks like to specify a file sharing domain. You just choose your domain URL, and when you create a file share, it'll send an email to the guest user that includes this link to return back to the file sharing repository, which you would define to be either local file directory on the local server, or maybe it's on network attached storage or something like that. You'd also need to configure SMTP so that Serv-U can email the guest user the file share request. Now, I'm going to disable this so that we can look at the protocols. And these protocols are for the file transfer domain. You simply check off the protocols that you would like to support, and the default ports will be listed corresponding to each one, but you can customize or override these if you like. Then you choose what IP listeners will be established on different interfaces on the host. Either all available addresses for both IPv4 and 6, or you can customize specific interfaces. Finally, what are your encryption preferences here? Once you finish this wizard, it will create a domain. You can create more than one domain if you like. And then the configuration settings are very similar to what you see at the global level. And you can override what's inherited from the global level here. And really the main point of all this is to establish the listeners that are specific to each domain. At this point, your FTP or MFT server would be configured and ready to transfer files.